Hey everybody, it's Bird Guy. Welcome back. Wanted to talk a little bit about some birds from this week. So Cricket and I were up along Skyline at Sunny Meadow, which is a entrance to Sanborn Park. Real beautiful trail. And as soon as we got out of the car, we saw a silent flycatcher on the top of a tree across the meadow. And you could see my spectacularly bad cell phone shot here, Digiscope. But there are a couple things about it that you can tell right away help narrow it down. Flycatchers are pretty daunting when you get into them because so many of them look alike. This one, however, you can sort of tell right away that it's a member of one genus, Contopus. Contopus, if you're not familiar, this wonderful book describes the names of scientific names of birds. Contopus means short-footed, and the reason for that name is that the tarsi of a bird corresponds with the human foot, whereas the toes are just the outer toes of what we think of as the foot on the bird. But in actuality, the tarsi corresponds to, I think they're called metatarsals in the human foot. They've been fused into one bone in birds in any case. So that's quite short on the Contopus flycatchers. And there are several, I think there are five or six Contopus flycatchers in North America, five. But only two really are regular in our area. That would be olive-sided flycatcher and western wood pewee. So because of the stance of this bird, this kind of upright posture, and just the general kind of silhouette of it, looks like a Contopus flycatcher of one kind, either an olive-sided flycatcher or a western wood pewee. So the problem is it was silent, couldn't use the call to help identify it, but we did finally identify it, and I'll show you how. So looking at the Sibley guide, you can see that olive-sided flycatcher has the same kind of stance as the bird in the blurry photograph, and so too does western wood pewee. Now, olive-sided flycatcher is famous for its three-syllable song, quick free beer, or sometimes kip, 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 reminiscent of red crossbill, I think. It also has that vest, that pale area in the center of the breast, and the dark kind of closing vest that wraps around the front. Our bird was not cooperating and didn't show us that until much later, so we couldn't use that either. But what I'll tell you is that the structure of the bird, let's go back to the photograph for an example at first. This bird here, to me, looks rather short-tailed. It's also at the very top of the tree. It's on the branch second from the top, but very close to the top, within a foot and a half of the very top. That's typical of olive-sided flycatcher. Western wood pewee tends to also be on bare branches, but usually not at the very top of a dead snag. Olive-sided flycatchers do that. So here we have a short-tailed bird, very close to the top of the tree, and occasionally also on the top of the tree. And we have a really blocky head, loggerhead flycatcher. Looking at western wood pewee, you can see that not only is the tail a little bit longer in proportion, but the head seems to be somewhat smaller compared to the body. Let's look at that again. So olive-sided flycatcher, western wood pewee. So looking at our mystery bird, we felt, without going any farther, that we were looking at an olive-sided flycatcher. Despite the fact that it was silent, it was at the top of the tree, it appeared blocky-headed and short-tailed. Now, another thing I forgot to point out about Contopus flycatchers is that they have very long primary projection. So If you believe you're seeing a Contopus flycatcher, but you're not quite sure, take a look at those primaries. Remember, we talked about that with Hammond's flycatcher. The primaries are very long on the wings, and that's the case with the olive-sided as well. They're long-distance migrants, which accounts for those long primary feathers. Another thing I'd like to point out is the relative softness of wing bars on the olive-sided flycatcher, whereas the western wood pewee always tends to show a little bit more prominent wing bar. So there's another thing that our bird was missing, prominent wing bars. So there you have it. Here's an image of the tail side by side. You could see that the olive-sided flycatcher, the primaries are just as long as they appear on the western wood pewee, but the tail is somewhat shorter on the olive-sided, and that makes a difference how the bird appears, even in silhouette, even in a blurry photograph. So later on, we did see the bird catch an insect, a large insect like a dragonfly, and then come back to the perch, and it revealed the front of its chest, which was clearly dark vested. So dark vest on the outside, pale center in the middle. Quite unlike the western wood pewee, which is a much more dusky, overall, sort of blurry, smudgy bird, not sharply defined vest of the olive-sided. So that was that. Okay, so I want to talk about solitary sandpiper. So that has shown up in our area, in our county, just this past week. It's an uncommon sandpiper. We usually see it on migration. It doesn't breed here, and it doesn't winter here for the most part. So it passes through spring and fall. And if you haven't seen solitary sandpiper before, it's a Tringa. Tringa is the genus that contains the yellowlegs. Recently, the willet was placed into the Tringa genus. And then there's also wandering tattler. So all of these are Tringas. And if you want to know what makes up a Tringa, I would say, for me at least, I always imagine Tringas as having lots of spots and also rather long legs and rather straight, delicate bills. So here's another good book that I like, and it does a good job of showing what a general Tringa sandpiper looks like. And one thing that's really nice about this book is at the beginning, it has some nomenclature for the different kinds of feather patterns that appear on shorebirds. And right here, you see these delicate spots on the edges of the tertials. That's pretty much what we're talking about with all the Tringas. They tend to show these little delicate spots on the edge of the feathers. Another book I like an awful lot. It's the Crossley Guide. Yes, it's for eastern birds, but I don't care about that because a lot of these birds are pretty widespread. And what's really nice is these great big plates that show you images of the birds in their natural habitat. So here you see the solitary sandpiper, and there are a couple things that are obvious here. One is the great big eye ring that it shows. Another is the dark underwing, and somewhere here you see the tail is dark in the center. That's very different from the yellowlegs. Both greater and lesser yellowlegs have got very pale tails with a pale rump. So the solitary sandpiper is somewhat different in that respect, but also the habitat that it chooses. It really likes freshwater puddles and ponds, creeks during migration. So the name solitary comes from the fact that it doesn't migrate with other birds of its kind. It's not a flocking bird. It's a very solitary bird. That applies to a bird I want to talk about in a couple of minutes. But you might also be interested about solitary sandpiper, besides the fact that it's found here only during migration, and it tends to be located on small ponds, small creeks, A lot of wetland areas that are surrounded by vegetation, trees, and things like that. Not the great big open mud flats that you find yellowlegs or willets in, but much more secluded areas. So you could sort of anticipate where a solitary sandpiper might be found. Like this week at Penitencia Creek recharge ponds. Those ponds are basically almost completely evaporated. There's just a little bit of water remaining at the bottom and a lot of debris there, a lot of fish that are trapped in the shallow water, and you have all the egrets and herons gathered there to look for that prey. And there's a spotted sandpiper there too. So spotted sandpiper also really likes fresh water, as you know, reservoirs and streams and lakes. So anyway, I think there's something particularly interesting about solitary sandpiper that you might find surprising. A lot of our shorebirds breed in Arctic tundra, and that's not at all where the solitary sandpiper breeds. If you can imagine a beautiful, delicate sandpiper with long legs, what would be one of the most unlikely places you'd expect it to breed, to nest? If you're thinking tree, you're correct. So the solitary sandpiper, like a few other shorebirds, nests in trees, in kind of muskeg, boggy ponds in Canada. And you might find it in the same area as you'd find olive-sided flycatcher or western wood pewee. So just kind of an interesting, surprising place for a sandpiper to nest. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the solitary vireos. That's cassins, plumbeus, and blue-headed. First, I want to point out that it's funny about solitary sandpipers. More often than not, I see them in twos, which kind of belies the whole name solitary, but it refers to they don't migrate they're not a flocking bird. It's really about that. But here are cassins, blue-headed, and plumbeus vireo as they're named now. But when I started birding in the mid-70s, they were collectively called solitary, the solitary vireo. And most of the books acknowledged that there were three basic color forms of them. But it wasn't until later that they were split out. So here's the first edition of National Geographic, where the three birds are still called solitary vireo, but there's a notation down here about the West Coast, the Rockies, the Eastern Range. So that corresponds with the three species we have now. And here, this is a first edition Peterson Western Guide, precious book, and you could see there that the solitary vireo still is referred to as solitary vireo. Back here, when these guides came out, the vireos were sort of positioned in the book near the warblers, because they have some superficial resemblance to warblers, but slower moving, and with a little bit of a hook on the bill. It wasn't until the third edition of National Geographic that not only were the three vireos split out into separate species, the three separate species, but the entire group of vireos was shifted back into the book closer to shrikes and corvids, where they stand now. So the corvidae, the corvoideae, include shrikes, corvids, and vireos. Anyway, so that's where they are right now. Okay, so I love cassins vireos. I love the whole triad of solitary vireos, but the cassins vireo I think is particularly nice. It's one of my favorite spring birds. So here you can see the lovely spectacles and the prominent wing bars that the bird has. It's a nice blend of bluish gray and greenish yellow or yellowish green. It's just very beautiful, I think. And its song is really intriguing. To me, it kind of sounds like questions and answers. So you have an upward phrase and a downward phrase, uh, something like Cassins, Vireo. Cassins, Vireo. Here, listen to it. You get the point. It's having a conversation with itself, and I think that's delightful. So, anyway, what I find kind of interesting is with closely related species to see how their maps lock into each other, how they puzzle piece together. And in this case, you can see that the Cassins vireo, C-A-V-I, Plumbeus vireo, and blue-headed vireo, B-H-V-I, they kind of form a nice seamless range over the United States and Canada during the breeding season. And you can see similar interesting puzzle piece relationships between the oak and juniper titmouse if you draw both those maps on a blank continent. You can see how they overlap, where they do not overlap, and it goes a long way towards explaining why the birds have been split. Okay, so that does it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to send in your questions to director@scvas.org. See you next time.
BIRDGUY.